the streets from the staff, the support on the street to our escorts, the support on the street was incredible. And I will say, it was devastating to all of us what happened, because the anti-choice zealots, and as I say, doctors being shot as time went on in BC, in Manitoba, in Ontario. The clinic was burned to the ground a few years later. There was an organized and very violent anti-choice movement. And what they did is to say that, you see what's going to happen if you continue? They tried to put fear and intimidate the doctors, the staff, the patients, and the supporters. And the staff at the women's bookstore were front and center being supporters. So we may have some different views of all this happened. We were in the middle of a battle that had to be won, because if we lost that battle, it would have set every struggle back. And that's why we have internal dispute regarding a proposed anti-racist policy guideline. The discussion ended in a split with the press, within the press, with some original members departing to form their own publishing house that became Second Story Press. The proposed anti-racist policy spoke to the issue of representation, the absence of BIPOC voices in Canadian publishing, the liberation work of feminist publishing, and questioning contexts in which a writer appropriates the form and substance of a culture which is oppressed by her own, or writes from the point of view of a protagonist from a non-dominant group. At the same time, Women's Press was making explicit its work around actively seeking to publish the work of racialized BIPOC, First Nations, women with disability, working class, poor women, lesbians, and bisexual women. Affirming that feminism as a liberatory movement, and this was a quote from the Women's Press guidelines then, that feminism as a liberation movement must include all women and oppose all systems of oppression that face women, including racism, anti-Semitism, classism, heterosexism, ethnocentrism, and many more isms. But the tiresome consternation of white privilege and debate related to issues of censorship and the writer and voice and the writer's voice began as recounted by Canadian writer Moreno Philip when the Women's Press rejected 3 short stories for an anthology in a short fiction book called Imagining Women, on the grounds that the writers in question, all white, had drawn and used the voices of characters from cultures and races other than their own. Moreno and writers of colors noted then that racism was the principal concern that the Women's Press and other artists were experiencing, or the practice of appropriating the voices of another. However, the mainstream media translated that dominant concern into an issue of censorship. Where have we seen? We see that time and time and time again. We saw that in Freedom Convoy now, where it was freedom protest, yeah? But at that time, the issue of censorship hold about white writers and their rights to use the voice of other. Moreno wrote that censorship in all its myriad forms became the privileged discourse, and that censorship and the cultural and that censorship as the cultural and political barometer which a society uses to measure its freedom was what was dominant. That the issue of racism never captured the degree of attention that censorship has enjoyed in Canada, and sadly, I would say that we still see remnants of that. Canadian author and feminist scholar Dianah Rand at the same time reflected that cultural appropriation is not a personal accusation, it is a critical category. It looks at the location of the text, at author in the world, as a given moment in history. That these moments are moments of gendering, of racing, of class-making, of other moments rooted in colonial conquest, in slavery, in economic exploitation. That it investigates the author's positioning, interacts with the author's interest in question, the author's interest with the text, and with colonial discourse. Brand argued then that liberal assumptions of universal subjectivity or downright denial of such location made the position and the critique of Canadian writing and publishing establishment suspect. Really, what the time? All right. So I will run to the end. You may almost. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. You see, feminist sisters giving permission. So the Toronto Women's Bookstore is in the midst of this conversation, and like Women's Press, was a part of the conversation about how to enable more BIPOC women to get the work into print without having to establish more publishing houses dedicated to publishing books by BIPOC Canada that we saw the creation of many self-governed and self-controlled BIPOC publishing houses. So I will name names. This was dedicated to publishing and making visible the work and voices of BIPOC writers that then graced the shelves at Toronto Women's Bookstore. I name Sister Vision, Black Women and Women of Color Press. I name Williams Wallace. I name Pemmican Publications and Titus Books, then two of the largest indigenous publishing houses in Canada. I name Tyler Lily, a journal by women of color. I name Diva, a journal of women of South Asian origin. I name Our Lives, Canada's first black women's newspaper. And finally, of particular mention, not black owned, not BIPOC owned, but a particular place in, I think, the hearts of many of us in this room, I name Press Gang, who published Christos and Brandt. I name Kinesis Magazine. You Kinesis, I know you're out there. And lastly, I name Fireweed. Many of us still hold dear the Women of Color edition. Thank you. Hard act to follow, but I knew that was the case. There's a fair bit of overlap here. I was asked to talk about feminist publishing in the time frame, the 70s and 80s. So, a quick review. Feminist publishing in Canada originally came out of the politics of the 70s. How about that? Came out of the politics of the 1970s, so nationalist and feminist movements. And it was kind of riven with a lot of those issues. So the nationalism was about not being American, and the feminism was really middle-class white women's movement. By the 1980s, feminist publishing was lively, engaging, growing nationally. When I look back, I can see it was just, well, you heard the list. It was just growing, expanding nationally and internationally. But as Angela has pointed out, it was also rife with internal contradictions. Women's Press, the largest and oldest, was founded in 1971-72. Press Gang published its first book in 1975 in Vancouver. Les Éditions de Remue-Ménage started in 1976, and there were a number of other Quebec publishers. Journals and magazines like Fireweed, Broadside, Rights, Tider Lily, Rumor of One's Own, Kinesis, Horizons, La Vie en Rose were publishing regularly. There was also a sense that a publisher like Women's Press was not interested in publishing black, indigenous, and racialized writers, was not representative, respectful, welcoming, supportive, or committed, and was not dealing with internal racism. Out of that, that empty space there, Sister Mission Press, which we just heard about, with a mandate to publish black women and women of color, was founded in 1985, motivated to create that space. So though essentially a political project, early feminist publishing houses have not always evolved politically. Instead, they evolved in response to pressures of being a business and of arts funding bodies, and perhaps stagnated politically. Beyond Canada, the feminist publishing was also kind of exploding in the U.S. To name a few, the Feminist Press, Aunt Lou, Kitchen Table, Seal Press, Fireman, Virago in UK, Kali for Women in India. And there were networks. There's a network of feminist publishers across North America that was able to meet once a year at the American Booksellers Association convention, where we all showed up to try and convince bookstores to buy our books. And there was also a network of feminist bookstores. So they were, at the same time, they came down there to see what all the books were. They showed up annually. And there was a trade publication called Feminist Bookstore News. So this was really a thriving, I want to say industry, but let's say sector. So to walk into the Toronto Women's Bookstore at the time was to step into possibility of all of this in a space that was also a community hub connected to grounding and supporting local feminist organizing and feminist academia. To borrow from a quote from May and Jude Revick, people always say that TWB was more than just a bookstore, and it was. TWB was a vibrant political, feminist, queer, and anti-racist community. But in the 1980s, the same cannot always be said of white, women-founded feminist publishing houses, though some engaged in the struggle to change. In my experience, feminist publishing is always more aligned with feminist movements than with mainstream publishing. Although I think that the women's press began to change internally, began to engage internally for change in the late 1980s, its publishing was not that different from other Canadian publishers, and that's a remark from basically that same article, The Disappearing Debate. So I brought a copy of the Almanac. We used to publish this every year. The first one that I bought is from 1981. And the last one, I think it was the last one we published, was 1999. And every year it would be focused around a different issue, and there would be a volunteer group who would put it together with support from staff. Women's Press was hugely supported by volunteers, a lot of whom were students through the 80s. I think for all of the 80s, we were on college just east of Spadina. Then the bookstore is over on Harvard. We're looking out on U of T, and a bike right away is Oise, which is loaded with feminist students and academics. So as we got into the struggle that Angela alluded to, there was a group of black women who were going to do the Almanac. And they started out thinking they would be, I think as they described it, it would be women winning out would be the original theme, and their intent was to focus on women of color who were achieving various goals in their lives despite the challenges of racism, child rearing, and poverty. But they grappled with that for a while and decided that was not the thing to be doing in this moment. And instead it took a new direction, which was, and the press was split. I think at the time they did the interviews, it was split into the groups, but nobody had left yet. So the Almanac is interestingly structured with interviews from people who took different positions, some who stayed, some who left, all talking about, thematically, about issues. So what they decided to do was to interview the women of Women's Press. We wanted the press to confront the contradictions between its stated politic and its actual practice as a socialist feminist organization, because that's how we held ourselves out, as a socialist feminist organization. Who better to ask than the women who have shaped or who have been associated with it? Women who have had the decision-making power in their organizations have to take responsibility for what their organizations have become. We felt that current developments might be better understood if placed in a historical context, and we proposed that the women of the press be featured in the Almanac within the context of the press's development as the political press. So it was an internal look. I think it was a key step in making the change, and I can finish it. So throughout this process, we regarded the Toronto Women's Bookstore as an ally and as a role model that was pointing the way as a leader to get us into the change period. And I think we can say that we actually got there. Change is powerful. Looking at yourself from the inside is beneficial, and it was really hard. Somebody interviewed me about this recently, and they said, well, how did you feel about it? And I was just on this long pause, and I said, well, how would you sum it up? And in the end, I just said it was transformative. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fun, though it had some great moments. But the bookstore all the way through, like knowing they were a few blocks away, but those of us who wanted change were thinking important to us as we went in, as they developed and brought in all those books Angela was talking about, and our publishing changed. It was just kind of lost in really the essence of community. Thank you. We got to run. Thank you to Carolyn, Angela, and Anne for providing such a deep, beautiful genealogy of feminist histories that exist in the 70s and 80s that would absolutely, the work being done would not have been able to have been done without that work. So thank you. All right, for our next conversation, we're going to be watching something through video. We'll be watching two speakers. Eloise Burke, with over 40 years of experience, works globally in international development as an organizational development practitioner. She focuses on building values-based work environments. Sharon Fernandez is a feminist grassroots activist with a passion for social justice. Her activist foundation is from the grassroots Black Caribbean Writers of Color movements in the mid-80s and 90s in Toronto and the U.S. Please provide a warm welcome for the conversation. I also do want to briefly note that there's been a lot of time and effort that's been based into organizing this event. There's a lot of feminist histories being offered to us, a lot of individuals who have provided a lot of beauty historically and are sharing that with us. I'd really, really warmly like us to provide our ear and listen to them attentively. Thank you. intermission, please. Please get some fresh air because we're going to give you guys more dialogue. If you need bathrooms, there are bathrooms downstairs in the basement. Accessible bathrooms are on this floor directly in front